What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Landlord Chick podcast. So this is the episode which I was kind of teasing you about, saying you guys are really going to enjoy it. I think it's going to be fun. We're going to create our own little episode here called Am I the Asshole Landlord? Now, this is not an actual Reddit thread that exists. At least I don't think it does. I can't admit to being a Reddit savant. In fact, as we'll talk about, there's only one particular situation where I have created a Reddit username and I've only used it this one time. But I've compiled from various forums that I've been a part of over the years questions that people have posed wondering if they're a bad landlord or were they an asshole in this situation. So I figured this is going to make a great episode. It's going to be fun. These are real life topics, real life situations. And we'll just kind of hash out the problem, how they addressed it, and we'll come to a conclusion as to whether or not they are an asshole landlord. Stay tuned. So I'm certainly not going to sit here and pretend to be the most technologically hip person. I was so late on the TikTok train that I only really got onto it last summer. And it's probably been around here for a number of years. And many of you listening to this are probably like, oh my gosh, I can't believe she just got on TikTok. Like, where has she been? I can't explain it. It's not that I'm this old crotchety person who doesn't like any technology. I love technology. I love embracing it. But I have my limitations, especially when it comes to social media. So for that reason, Reddit falls into that category. It's nothing that I've never really dived into. And as I teased in the intro, I have one particular situation why I was on Reddit. So I was on Reddit. I created a username and everything. So I could post in a forum for a specific online racing game because my husband and I were struggling to get his wheel calibrated for this video game called iRacing. His wheel was older and all this other stuff. And so finally I'm like, you know what? I wonder if Reddit can help. Like, I don't even know why I thought Reddit could help. But I'm like, all right, I'll go over there. So I created a username, a very, very geeky username for me, which I'm not even going to say here because no one will get it. But it's very, very historical geeky. And I posed my question on there about iRacing and this wheel. And that's been my full extent of Reddit interaction. Now, of course, Reddit is everywhere else because people have made entire segments of YouTube videos, podcasts, talk shows about reading Reddit forums. And I know there is a forum called Am I the Asshole? At least, is it a forum? Is it a thread? See, I don't even know what it is. But I know there's a thread out there that says, Am I the Asshole? And over the years, I thought it'd be really interesting and fun to look at this from a landlord approach. And since I don't Reddit, I couldn't actually find a specific one for Am I the Asshole Landlord? And I think I can understand why, because I think in a very public forum like that, it would quickly go awry. So I began to wonder in the past couple of weeks if I could cultivate the idea of Am I the Asshole Landlord by just taking snippets out of Facebook groups, online real estate forums I'm a part of, and just saving these queries that people have posed, tell you the story, and we can kind of dissect what happens. So this is the first ever installment of Am I the Asshole Landlord? I've pulled these different scenarios from the various sources I described. I don't want to pretend that any of these are recent. So like if we get into one of these, it's like a seasonal story. You might be like, hey, but wait a minute, it's winter right now. Understand I've kind of curated these over a long time, ones that have stuck in my head like, hey, I wonder if I can find this again. And I've just been saving these up for sort of rainy day stuff. And it all kind of fit into this one great category. So let's dive into it. Am I the Asshole Landlord? So this first one I found over on Bigger Pockets. It's a couple years old by now, but I had actually taken a screenshot of it and everything. And I don't remember why I particularly saved it, but here we go. I own a 4-unit, and I was recently at my property doing weeding and landscaping. While I was there, a police car rolled up with its lights and sirens on. Police officer went immediately to the back of the vehicle and got his medical bag. He ran up to the building, asking me if I knew where apartment 2 was. I told him I was the landlord, I could let him into the building, which has a locked key, and I could show him to the unit. At the unit, he asked me if I would be able to open it, because it was a medical emergency where the person inside had called 911, but had apparently passed out while they were on the phone with the 911 operator. Police told me it was probably my best interest to open the door with my key because if I didn't, they were just going to knock it down anyway. Obviously, I made the logical decision to open the door for the police. I let him into the unit. I continued to stand in the living room while he went into the bedroom and did his thing. He then asked me to let in the paramedics that were also arriving shortly after him, which I did. I came back to the unit, and at that moment, when I had time, I was looking around the unit and I discovered on the dining room table pot paraphernalia. I took a mental note of this, but obviously I wasn't immediately concerned with it as there were bigger issues at play here, because my tenant was being wheeled out on a stretcher with an oxygen bag over their head and everything. A couple days later, the tenant came back from the hospital because I'm not a complete, I'll say asshole here, they used a different word, because I'm not a complete asshole. I stopped by their unit, asked how they were doing, inquired about what had happened like any normal person would do, and just trying to make sure that they're okay. Once I'd completed that conversation with them, I went home that night and I began to think about what I had seen on that dining room table. Now, that day when I showed up, it was no longer visible for whatever reason. However, I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I thought about this over the next week, and ultimately I kept coming back to this idea that I have in my clause no illegal substances in my buildings. This property is in a state where marijuana is not legal yet. I decided to give this tenant adequate notice to move out of my property for a lease violation. I recently told my wife this last night, and she says I'm an asshole. She says that if it had not been for that medical emergency, if I had not been there weeding, I would never have known that this particular tenant had had that paraphernalia in their unit. They've been a really good tenant, never late on rent, never caused issues for other people. However, I looked at it very black and white and said this particular tenant broke a lease violation. So am I the asshole landlord? Well, let's dissect this. We do have a very unique situation here. Obviously, most every one of us listening to this podcast likely has a clause in our leases that says no illegal substances. Obviously, by following the spectrum of where the talk has gone with marijuana, regardless of whether it's legal in your state for recreation or for medical, generally speaking, the feeling of marijuana has started to take a turn for the general public where it's not quite as consequential. Many states have gotten to the point where even their local municipalities, their state troopers in states where it's not legal are not necessarily highly enforcing it because it's becoming so hard to police with how legal it is becoming. So we have that aspect of this, which I think is really important to be sure that we include. The other aspect of this is the wife, in my opinion, is correct. You would not have known that this stuff was there if this medical emergency had not happened and if you had not been there taking care of the property. In any other situation, had this specific event unfolded, you never would have known because you wouldn't have been in the unit. In this particular tenant, they say they have no other issues with, meaning obviously whatever they do with that marijuana is, if you want to call it, under control or whatever, but it doesn't interfere with anything else. So in my opinion, was this landlord an asshole landlord? I'm going to say yes. And I know many people are going to be like, oh, well, it's drugs and it's a lease violation. And I think we have to look at this from the perspective of this is not a black and white situation. If there had been a posted notice for an occupied inspection and the paraphernalia was just left on the dining room table anyway, then yes, I'd say you distinctly could ride that clause hard and fast until the cows come home and say, yes, you need to get out of my property because you violated my clause. But we have to take every situation not at face, but also considering all the little elements that play into it. I've had the opportunity to go on multiple ride-alongs with the police department here. And I'm always fascinated at what I learn and how they choose to navigate the constant decisions they have to make. On one of my first ride-alongs, we went to a medical emergency in a building. And despite the fact that there was medical. I shouldn't say medical, but this person was obviously ill. I think they were using the marijuana for medical reasons, but it still wasn't legal here. It still isn't legal here. But it was flat out, and there was a lot of stuff there, like not necessarily like dealer level, but there was a lot of stuff there. And I remember after everything had calmed down, I asked the police officer, I'm like, well, why didn't you arrest or issue a ticket or whatever for the marijuana? And he said, because when we come into these positions, we're not here to take advantage of every single thing and write them up for everything. We look at the situation and go, okay, we were here because this happened. It was an unfortunate situation where this person is the victim of something. Unless, of course, it's going to be a hardcore drug like cocaine, I'm not going to go any further with something like marijuana. So I think about that in the back of my head, about how much we have to take into consideration sort of these negating elements that play into a situation that we might be a part of. And the negating elements in this situation is, it was a medical emergency. Tenant was unconscious. They couldn't answer their own door. They couldn't take themselves to the ER or anywhere they needed to go. You just happened to be there as the landlord to let them in, and you chose to go in the apartment rather than sort of waiting in the hallway. I'm going to err on the side of saying that, yes, he is the asshole landlord. I would side with his wife. I would say you shouldn't have done that, and I wouldn't have done that. All right. Am I the asshole landlord number 2? I have an old converted home which has a common hallway for all 3 of my tenants. One of my tenants is of an ethnic background where she likes to cook, as it's worded here, creative dishes. These are dishes that are not normal to our American cuisine or any sort of standard cuisine that we think of. As a result of cooking these meals, there's often an aroma, in quotations, that wafts out into the common areas of the building. One of my tenants had recently complained about this smell, and I felt like I had to do something about it. Now, I know I can't just tell her, you can't cook that because it stinks, especially given the repercussions for nationalism or ethnicity discrimination. So instead, I asked the tenant politely if she could be sure to turn on her hood exhaust fan and open both the kitchen window and the sliding glass door whenever she chooses to cook these aromatic dishes, in quotations, as I worded them to her. Am I the asshole for making her open her windows and use her exhaust fan when she cooks these dishes to prevent the aroma from coming into the common area and disturbing other tenants? So here we have a situation where you have a tenant who likes a certain cuisine, regardless of whether it's ethnic or not. They like a certain cuisine. It creates certain smells that people maybe normally wouldn't find very enticing, appetizing, and they are on the opposite end of the scale. It creates this sort of pungent smell to most noses. Now, the tenant is not doing anything illegal. She's cooking in her apartment. She happens to be cooking things that don't smell nice to everybody. And maybe the ethnicity is a little bit of a complicating factor, but I don't think it's too important here, because really it comes down to this idea of, can you police what somebody is cooking in their apartment, assuming they're not going Breaking Bad or anything like that? If it wafts into the living room, it's their apartment. If it wafts into the hallway, well, then what can you really do about it? What should you do about it? And I have to admit that I think this landlord ended up going a step further than I would have. I think if I were presented with the situation, I don't think there would have been anything that I would have done other than just explain to the tenant who complained that, unfortunately, it's not within my purview to ask her to stop or anything like that. Now, of course, I could logically go the route of adding air fresheners to the building, but first off, she said it's an old converted home. So there's a strong possibility she doesn't have electrical outlets in the hallway. I have a building built in 1858, and I don't have electrical outlets in the hallway there. So when I wanted to try and combat a tenant odor, I had to get one of those battery-operated ones. And even then, I ended up doing more harm than good, because basically I put that in trying to prevent the cat smell and pot smell from wafting overwhelmingly into the hallway and everything like that with this particular tenant. And instead, what I ended up doing was creating a smell which makes you think that there's a pot smoking cat who collects lilacs that lives there. So that probably wasn't my best course of action. But that's what I thought would handle the situation. Now, in this particular landlord, was what they did okay? Sure, it's perfectly legal. You're making a request. You're not requiring, but you're making a request. And you're making a request so that they can continue to cook. Obviously, you have no purview over whether or not they cook those dishes or not. But they can continue to cook without feeling like they're affecting the other residents simply by opening their 2 windows and running their hood fan. I think that's a very amicable solution, and I think, honestly, this is a good landlord. I don't think this belongs in any sort of category of being a bad landlord. I think this is almost the quintessential landlord that a lot of people wished they had, because a landlord was presented with a problem. They didn't bring a solution that was overwhelmingly in one favor towards one side or not. They went middle of the road with it. They didn't tell the tenant who complained, yeah, I'm going to tell her she can't cook that, or I'm going to tell her that, she can only cook it certain days or limit how much she cooks it. No, he said, okay, I'm going to try and address it, but understand there's certain things that I cannot do. Then he goes to the tenant who does the cooking and says, hey, I was wondering if you'd be able to open your windows and use your hood fan. It's a very middle of the road way with this particular situation, and I do commend it, because this is exactly how I think a lot of tenants would prefer a situation like this be handled. Now, of course, it's very likely that the complaining tenant is not 100% happy, because there's a strong possibility they're just going to assume that it's going to continue to smell, and they might even just subconsciously smell it because they're so offended by the smell. But the actions show that the landlord was trying to come to a reasonable solution for both sides. And that's why I really like the approach that this landlord took. I have a third one for you guys, and this is honestly one of my favorites. Because it really did cross this line over into sort of an extreme situation, and I'll give it away up front. I don't think it was handled in the best way. I own a duplex that I've had the same tenant in for over 10 years. Recently, this particular tenant got into a car accident, and she was hospitalized for an extensive amount of time. While she had been living there, her daughter had graduated from high school and gone on to college. When her mother had the car accident, she came back, dropped out of college for the semester, and came back to take care of her mom. She chose to live in the apartment. I was unsure how long she would be living there, but after a couple weeks, I decided we needed to have a conversation to figure out if she was going to be responsible for the lease or not. In my lease, I say everyone over the age of 18 who's going to live in the unit for more than 1 week a year needs to be signed on to the lease. At this point, I was violating the lease. I guess I should admit that at this point, the tenant, her mother, was still in a coma and was unable to make any sort of decisions. I simply looked at it from the perspective of, I don't know who's responsible for this apartment. I don't know who's going to be paying rent. I felt like I had no control over what was going on. After the daughter had been home for 3 weeks, I approached the daughter before the new rental period and asked her what the intentions were. She said that her mother had enough savings in place and she had college loans that she was going to use to pay for the rent so she would continue to live here and be on time. She didn't want to give up the apartment until she knew that either her mom wouldn't need it or it would meet her needs when she got out of the hospital. I agreed with that course of action. However, I pointed out to her that she was not a legal person on the lease and that she would need to apply to be put on the lease. The daughter dragged her feet on this for a little bit, and after a while, I felt I had no other choice but to tell her that if she did not apply for the apartment, I would be issuing a notice for a violation of lease clause for subletting or unauthorized personnel. At this point, other family members got involved. While my tenant had been divorced from her husband for many years, the father of the daughter came into the picture and started calling me. He started telling me that I was being cold-hearted and that I needed to give some time for the family to figure out the situation. Why was it so important to me that I know who was responsible for the apartment as long as it was being paid for? He said, if it's a payment issue, I will pay up front for my daughter to live there for 4 months, if that would keep you off her back. I told him that was not the issue, that the issue at hand was in regards to who's on the lease and who's responsible for it. At this point, I have no point of action of what I'm going to do with this. I feel like I need to have the daughter on the lease because otherwise there's nobody technically living there because I know the mother's in the hospital and in a coma. I don't know if this is something that I should be overtly concerned about. Am I a bad landlord for trying to get someone to be of legal age on the lease who is not in the hospital in a coma? Yes, you're the asshole. The reason you're the asshole is because you're doing this within what, a month of this mom have a very serious car accident. The daughter's chosen to drop out of college and forego the next semester. Like, this is a serious car accident. This is not something where, oh my gosh, you got rear-ended and mom, you're going to be in a neck brace for a couple weeks. Like, this sounds serious. So while I totally understand wanting to be sure that you're getting rent, but you've already been told by the daughter and by the father, the ex-husband, that rent's not going to be an issue. You had an offer on the table to have 4 months prepaid. So if there was going to be any issue in this situation that you could be a stickler on, I feel like that could be the one that you could be a stickler on. But you can't be a stickler on it before the rent's due. And in this situation, you were looking towards the next month and going like, hey, there's going to be a new rental period up. You know, who's going to be responsible for the lease, so on and so forth. If rent is being paid in this situation, I don't think you should care necessarily who is legally staying there. You have a situation where her daughter's obviously heartbroken. She has no idea the condition her mom's going to come out in. She has bigger things on her mind right now. So as long as rent's being paid and the tenant is not trashing the place, she's not disturbing anyone else, I don't see what the issue is here. You know, sure, maybe down the road, if it turns out that the mom comes home from the hospital and a month and a half later, the daughter's still living there. Maybe you find out the daughter's going to continue to live there like through the rest of the spring semester and through summer break. Then okay, maybe you broach the conversation. Now, do you have her apply? No. I think having her apply in this situation is a really cold-hearted move. I would simply add her to the lease. She's there trying to take care of a parent. She's not there because she got evicted from somewhere or because something went wrong at college. She's literally there trying to help her mom. So in this situation, yes, you are an asshole landlord. You are the reason that we end up with bad stories in the news. And not necessarily because you did this, but because of the timing of it. You didn't even give things a month to settle down. You didn't give them time to breathe and figure out what was going on with the mom. If anyone's ever had a tenant die in the middle of a lease, like, you can't just go to the family and say, oh, I'm sorry, you've got to bury your brother, your sister, your daughter next week. But, you know, by the way, what's going on with the unit? You don't do that. And this falls into the category of things that you just don't do. You give it time to play out first. And then you address it in a manner which has compassion to it. And there really was a lack of compassion here. There was a lack of compassion for what the daughter had chose to do. There was a lack of compassion for what the daughter was going through. And I think to a certain extent, there was a lack of compassion for the tenant who was in the hospital. Because basically, by forcing the daughter to kind of apply and decide to plant roots there, you could be forcing a situation where the mother is no longer going to come home to the unit that she previously had secured for herself, simply because her daughter moved in. What if her daughter hadn't chosen to stay there, but you continued to get the rent? Would you have an issue? No, you probably wouldn't. And that's why I think in this situation, yes, this person was an asshole landlord. We need to remember to have compassion when we're interacting with our tenants. Our first story, when we talked about the person who had the medical emergency, that is something that deserves compassion and a moment of grace. They weren't a problem tenant. You happened upon that in unfortunate circumstances. An element of compassion should have been exercised. And in this one, we come back to this element of compassion. Way too often we hear about landlords who do not have compassion, who are cold-hearted, who choose to forget the human aspect of real estate investing. When we're approached with these situations, when they're dealt to us, these are the ones that make or break the pattern of laws. It's the times when we end up being unwilling to bend, unwilling to acquiesce to a moment. When we forget to have compassion, that's where we get rules and regulations created from. So yes, this person was the asshole landlord. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode. Like I said, I've wanted to do this for a while. I've been storing up these little things that I've saved for various reasons. And I'm like, you know what? I want to start doing this. So if you guys liked this, please share this episode. Let people know that it exists, because if we get a lot of traction from this, I can choose to make this a regular segment. Now, I can't say we have enough content for a monthly segment, but maybe it'd be a cool quarterly thing that we do. Once a quarter, we revisit this idea of, am I the landlord asshole? I hope you guys have a great week. I hope you guys learned something. At the very least, I hope you learn to remember that compassion exists in real estate investing. And I will see you next time. Bye.